Good morning, I'm Jessica, and today we have Hannah
Hello.
with us here today to talk about sensory motor approaches and the Brunnstrom theory. We are both from the OTD class of 2024, and welcome to our podcast today. First off, we're going to discuss the background of motor control and each level. This will be the basis for the approaches we'll discuss later on in the podcast. So take it away, Hannah.
Hello. So we have three different levels of the central nervous system structures that are involved in motor control. And so each of them have a specific function as well. So the first is that motivational urge that we have before the motor movement happens. And so that is considered the highest level, and the limbic system is in control of all of that.
Okay, I think it would be really grateful to have an example. Helpful, not grateful, to have an example to think about as we go through the different levels. So what about drinking a glass of water? Like before you reach for the glass of water, your motivation would be that you're thirsty.
Yes, that's actually a really good example. And that's a great way to think about it. So after you kind of establish your motivation, programming and planning of that motor movement begins to happen. And so that occurs in the basal ganglia, the lateral cerebellum, and the premotor cortex. And so that typically happens really, really quickly. And so if you kind of want to talk about your example that you just gave, but with the planning of it.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So relating back to our example before about the glass of water, this would be your brain planning the movements of how your arm is going to reach for the glass of water in front of you on the table.
Yeah, exactly. So now your last level is the lower level, and it's broken up into a lower central level and then a lower peripheral level. And so those are both responsible for motor execution, actually doing that movement. And so the actual movement that occurs is what this level is responsible for. But anyway, the brain and spinal cord control the lower central level, and then the peripheral nervous system is controlling the peripheral level.
Okay, I have a question. With all that being said, when I'm reaching for the cup, how do I know where to grasp the cup? How do I know how to grasp it tightly? Like if I should grasp it tightly or lightly, depending on the weight of the cup. Like how do I determine how heavy it is in general? How am I able to carry it from the table? Also from the table and all the way to my mouth. How do we do that?
So that is a really good question. So your brain relies on sensorimotor feedback in order to successfully coordinate those motor movements. And so that's one of the most essential parts of the process, and we can't do it without it. So I'm very glad you mentioned that.
All right. That makes so much more sense now that we have that example for us. Next, would you like to discuss a little brief overview with us about the sensory motor approaches that OTs use in intervention? I know these can be super difficult to understand sometimes at first, and honestly, often in practice, OTs don't always use everything. They just use bits and pieces.
Yes, so that is right. So there are 4 sensorimotor approaches, and those are the root approach, the Brunnstrom approach, the proprioceptive neuromuscular approach, and then the Bovath approach. And so we'll talk in more detail about the Brunnstrom approach later on. But first I'll tell you just a little bit about the sensorimotor innervation approaches just in general. So these approaches focus more on the middle and lower level, kind of what we explained earlier. So which is going to be the motivation and the planning aspect, not the execution. But the foundational concept of all these approaches is teaching the client the compensatory strategies to adapt to deficits that occur from a lesion. And so, like we talked about earlier, these approaches really rely heavily on that sensory stimuli and intrinsic feedback in order to get the correct movement.
Well, with all that being said, how does all of this relate back to occupation?
So that's
also
our
goal.
Yes, that's a great question because one of the main limitations of these approaches is that you don't really target an occupation or a client's motivation to complete a motor movement. So that is actually our job as an OT to be intentional and foster and generalize those movement patterns to a meaningful occupation when doing those tasks. So that is our main job, and that's a very important part of it.
Oh, well, appreciate you answering that. Lastly, would you mind discussing the Brunnstrom approach? I know this approach was designed for individuals who suffer from stroke, and it helps describe the recovery process after stroke. The recovery process is broken down into, I think like different stages, right?
Yes, that is right. That's exactly right. So it's actually broken down into 7 stages, and they each describe the flexor and extensor synergy patterns that the client might have at that time. And so that's just like the different tone levels, basically. And we'll actually discuss that more in class in detail, but that's the overall gist. But as OTs, we base our treatment interventions off their current stage at the time. So.
Like, not to ad lib or anything, but just going over like synergy patterns. I think at first when I was trying to figure out what those meant, it was really helpful to break down synergy and what synergy meant, which is basically the way our muscles contract. And like a flexor synergy pattern would, like an example would be when our shoulder flexes forward, then our elbow will flex and our wrist will flex at the same time. So that would be an example of a flexor synergy pattern. So that helps to have that like visual aid as you're figuring out the different stages. So, but thank you so much, Hannah,
You're
for
welcome.
being with us today. I think next week it will be Jen and Megan, and they'll be discussing with us the neurodevelopmental treatment. So I hope this all just helps you understand everything a little bit better about sensorimotor approaches. And thank you so much, and I hope you guys have a really great day.
Yes, thank you.